For centuries, visitors walking down the long, silent corridors of European palaces would end up stopping in front of an enormous painting that seemed to defy any attempt at quick comprehension. At first glance, many believed they were looking at just another ancient religious work, similar to the many depictions of paradise, creation, or hell that were common in medieval art. But it only took a few seconds in front of that panel to realize that something there was profoundly different. People approached slowly, inclined their bodies, squinted their eyes to try to understand the small details, and soon began to point out strange things. Creatures that did not exist in any known bestiary, giant objects used in absurd ways, human figures trapped in situations almost impossible to explain. Some visitors laughed nervously. Others were completely silent. There are reports of people remaining in front of the painting for long minutes, sometimes even more than an hour, simply trying to understand what they were seeing. An observer once wrote that the painting seemed to contain hundreds of stories happening at once. Another said it was like looking into a collective dream of humanity, full of images that were fascinating and disturbing at the same time. Perhaps the most curious comment came from a visitor who said that the painting seemed to show everything that human beings desire, and at the same time, everything that they fear becoming. The most intriguing thing is that this work was not created in a time of modern artistic experimentation. It did not emerge in an avant-garde movement or in a period of abstract art. On the contrary, it was painted more than 500 years ago, when much of European art followed very clear and traditional religious patterns. Even so, this picture seems almost impossible for its time. Many art historians say that it seems to have been created by someone who saw the world in a completely different way than his contemporaries. Someone who imagined entire universes full of symbols, creatures, and visual metaphors to talk about something much bigger than a simple biblical story. And when we finally reveal what this painting is, we understand why it remains one of the most mysterious and fascinating works in the history of art. We are talking about the Garden of Earthly Delights, a gigantic triptych created by the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch at the end of the 15th century, probably between 1490 and 1510. Bosch lived in the Netherlands during a period of profound cultural and religious transformations in Europe. It was a time when religion shaped virtually every aspect of everyday life, and works of art often served as tools of moral teaching. Paintings and sculptures were used to remind people of the consequences of sin, the promise of paradise, and the fear of hell. However, Bosch did not exactly follow the conventional path of many religious artists of his time. Instead of representing biblical stories in a simple and straightforward way, he seemed interested in exploring something deeper: the human imagination, hidden desires, collective fears, and the contradictions of human nature itself. His paintings often feature hybrid creatures, fantastic landscapes and situations that seem straight out of dreams or nightmares. For this reason, many art historians consider Bosch to be a kind of precursor to much later movements such as surrealism. The Garden of Earthly Delights is perhaps the work that best represents this unique vision. The painting is a triptych, that is, it is made up of 3 large panels that can be closed like doors. When the triptych is closed, we see a relatively simple picture of the world during creation. The earth appears represented in gray tones, almost monochromatic, as if it were a silent planet surrounded by a transparent sphere. There are no human beings visible in this part, and the atmosphere feels calm and primordial, as if we are observing the world before its story really begins. Some scholars interpret this external image as representing the 3rd day of creation described in the book of Genesis, when God separates the earth from the waters and the planet begins to take shape. This initial part of the work works almost like a silent prologue to everything that will be revealed later. But when the panels open, the viewer is immediately confronted with an explosion of colors, shapes, and details. 3 different worlds appear before your eyes, each representing a distinct phase of the human experience. In the left panel, we find a relatively familiar scene within the Christian tradition, the Garden of Eden. There we see God presenting Eve to Adam, a symbolic moment that represents the birth of humanity according to the biblical narrative. The landscape all around it is lush, full of crystal clear rivers, exotic plants, and animals of different species. However, even in this apparently peaceful scenario, Bosch is already starting to introduce strange elements. There are creatures that look like mixtures of different animals, giant birds that observe the scene, and natural structures that don't look like anything we find in real nature. Bosch's paradise seems beautiful, but also slightly unsettling, as if it were a world where the rules of reality have not yet been completely defined. Some animals seem to behave unusually, as if anticipating the chaos that will arise later in other panels. In the central panel we find the most famous and most complex part of the work, the true Garden of Delights. Here the landscape transforms into an almost impossible scenario, where hundreds of naked human figures interact in activities that seem at once playful, sensual, and absurd. People ride animals, dive into circular lakes, carry giant fruits, and hide inside shells or gigantic plants. Some figures appear to be playing strange games, while others walk in groups as if they were exploring that fantastic world for the first time. The overall feeling is one of constant movement, as if all of humanity is experiencing every possible pleasure of physical life. Many historians interpret this panel as a representation of humanity given over to earthly pleasures. Giant fruits, for example, were often associated with pleasure and temptation in medieval symbolism. They are sweet, attractive, and irresistible, but they are also fragile and deteriorate quickly, making them a perfect symbol for life's fleeting pleasures. The giant birds may represent instinctive impulses, while the fragile, translucent structures scattered across the landscape suggest that this entire seemingly cheerful universe could disappear at any moment. The most impressive thing is the number of small stories hidden within this panel. In one corner, we see people sliding over curved surfaces as if they were participating in some kind of surreal game. At another point, human figures move in and out of open fruit as if they were temporary homes. Elsewhere, birds carry people in their beaks as if they were passengers on a strange journey. There are entire groups of characters organized in circles. Others seem to form queues, while some simply observe what is happening around them. Each small group of characters appears to represent a different scene, almost as if Bosch were creating dozens of parallel narratives within the same painting. Many visitors who observe the work in person report that it is impossible to absorb all the details in a single observation. The more time you spend looking, the more things appear, as if the painting reveals new layers with each look. But it is in the right panel that the atmosphere changes completely. If the center represents pleasure and temptation, the last panel shows the end result of this path, hell. The landscape becomes dark and chaotic. Cities are burning in the background. Demonic creatures walk among ruins, and human souls are subjected to grotesque punishments. One of the most famous features of this part of the painting is the so-called musical hell. Giant instruments such as harps, lutes, and drums are transformed into torture machines. People are crushed by instrument strings or trapped inside gigantic musical structures. Some scholars believe that Bosch was criticizing the excesses of entertainment and profane music of his time, transforming symbols of pleasure into tools of eternal punishment. Among the most intriguing figures in this panel is the famous tree man. He has legs that look like broken trunks, a hollow body and a face that observes the scene with a strange, almost melancholy expression. Inside its open torso is what looks like a small tavern where tiny figures gather while chaos ensues all around. Many historians believe that this character may be a kind of symbolic self-portrait of Bosch himself, as if the artist were observing the hell he imagined. When looking at the three panels together, many experts interpret the work as a complete narrative about the human condition. The left panel represents the origin of humanity in paradise. The central panel shows humanity exploring limitless desires, pleasures, and curiosities, and the panel on the right reveals the consequences of this path. However, Bosch never explains this message directly. There are no texts within the painting that say exactly what each symbol means. Everything is constructed through visual metaphors that can be interpreted in many different ways. Some researchers believe that the work is a religious warning against the dangers of excess and temptation. Others suggest that Bosch was imagining a hypothetical world where human beings live solely for pleasure, without moral conscience. There are also interpretations that see the painting as a social critique, full of irony and dark humor about human behavior. The fact that there are so many different interpretations shows how complex and open the work is. Bosch has created something that works almost like a gigantic visual puzzle. Each viewer finds new meanings depending on the time they spend observing and the ideas they bring with them. And this is precisely what explains the curious reactions of the visitors mentioned at the beginning of the story. When someone looks at the Garden of Earthly Delights for the first time, they are not just looking at a painting. You are entering a symbolic universe full of enigmas. Every detail seems to invite the viewer to reflect on desire, morality, pleasure, excess, and consequence. Perhaps that is why, even after more than 500 years, this work continues to fascinate historians, artists, and curious people around the world. She always seems to have something new to reveal, as if she were a visual maze created to challenge our interpretation of humanity itself. And perhaps the visitor who said that the painting shows everything humanity desires and everything it fears realized something essential. Bosch wasn't just painting heaven or hell. He was creating a symbolic mirror of humanity, showing our deepest impulses, our most seductive temptations, and the paths we choose to follow. Now the final question is, when you look at this universe imagined by Bosch, which of the three worlds seems closest to human reality? The initial paradise, the chaotic garden of pleasures, or the hell full of consequences? Perhaps the answer says more about us than about the painting itself. If you liked this analysis and want to continue exploring the mysteries hidden in the great works of art history, leave here in the comments which painting you would like to see in the next video. Don't forget to like, because this really helps the channel to grow. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss the next fascinating stories hidden within the works that have intrigued humanity for centuries.